welcome into the sneak peek edition of the Desmond Johnson Show. I'm your host, Desmond Johnson. If you hadn't heard, brand new format coming to the Triad every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday of each week. Loaded panels set up for you. Everyone from Jalen Gilkey from WFMY News 2 to George Teague, former safety for the Dallas Cowboys and Green Bay Packers, will be in each week talking NFL football, college football, ACC stuff, Hornets, Panthers, and much, much more. Super excited. Presented to you by Emergency Responders Credit Union here in Winston-Salem. Definitely check them out if you are a first responder. They are the bank for you. Loaded sneak peek today on August the 8th on PBS at 10 p.m. will be the debut of When They Were Giants, a documentary on the famous or infamous Dorton Arena in Raleigh at the North Carolina State Fairgrounds. And with me today are the producers of that documentary from WRAL, Chris Lee, and the person who helped produce this package, Ciff Bumgardner, on the show. What's going on, fellas? How are you guys doing?
What's up, Des? Good to join you again, and congratulations on the new show and everything. And so excited to talk to you about When Giants Walked here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, super excited about. Chris told me about this months ago. I think we were at Glenn or someplace doing a basketball game or setting up for it, and we were just talking before the game. And he mentioned that he was getting involved with this, and he knows that I'm a pro wrestling fan. Grew up on it. Some of my fondest memories are sitting on my grandfather's lap watching Saturday Night Wrestling on TBS, hating Ric Flair, loving Dusty Rhodes. Like if you grew up in this area in North Carolina, yeah, WWF existed, and it was something we watched on Saturdays, and it was more polished. It was more almost cartoonish in the 80s, whereas Mid-South Wrestling, Jim Crockett promotions, eventually NWA, WCW wrestling was more grittier. It was more dirtier. You were more prone to see some stuff you didn't expect to see, and you were more, I think, in tune with the wrestlers themselves. But start us off here. How did you guys get this idea to do this documentary on Dorton, and specifically its special relationship here in the Carolinas and Virginia with wrestling? How did this idea come about between you two?
Well, I kind of kicked it off. I born and raised in North Carolina. I've been a wrestling fan my whole life. And growing up, I live in Raleigh and going to the fairgrounds all the time for the flea market, for the state fair, whatever was in town. And when you go to the fairgrounds, you can't miss Dorton. For folks who don't know, it is a large spaceship-looking building. It's famous the world over for its architecture. It's an architectural marvel is really how it's considered. It's on several national registries and that kind of thing. So it's a revered building, and I would always be interested in it. And then my dad would tell me, well, there used to be wrestling there too. And I grew up in the 90s when there wasn't much wrestling or wrestling really at all after a certain point in Dorton. And so I always wondered about those shows, and I grew up hearing about those shows. But it wasn't until I was an adult and I sort of got back into wrestling and got really into the history of wrestling that I started to see how so much of the history of the sport of pro wrestling, the culture, the business, the world of pro wrestling kind of cross paths with Dorton Arena, this building that I knew that was, right down the street from me my whole life. And so I just started researching it, thinking it would be kind of a small story, and it grew from there. And we realized that there were so many different things that all kind of combined in that one building. And particularly with the lens of pro wrestling was a way to tell an interesting wrestling story from a Dorton perspective and to tell an interesting Dorton story from a wrestling perspective. So wherever folks are coming from, there's something new, something different that they'll find in the film. And I knew Chris from, I used to work at WRAL. We crossed paths very briefly, but I knew that Chris used to be a wrestler and reached out to him, and we started working on this thing together. And that was almost 3 years ago. So been a long time, but we're excited for folks to see it.
Yeah. And when I came to WRL, Desmond, I knew about WRL's involvement in wrestling. A lot of Jim Crockett promotions, TV shows were filmed there in the studio. I do sports in, every night. And so I knew I wanted to do something wrestling related. I was thinking coming into WRL that maybe there were some tapes there. I got there and discovered there are no tapes there because WWE either owns them or they were taped over each other every single week.
Oh, man.
Which is what they did back in the day. They weren't thinking about archiving a lot of different things. So when I got that email from Ciff back in 2021 about this, I was excited to be a part of it and try to do a new form of storytelling, new to me. Since I've been in print, radio, and television, and that was the first opportunity I had to do something in the documentary space. So excited to be along for the ride and help out to, bring some of the names to this wrestling documentary.
And it's super interesting too, because again, as a kid, I'm 46, so I'm dating myself. As a kid watching pro wrestling in the 80s, you had multiple options because back then it was wrestling territories where, different factions had different parts of the map of the country, and rarely was there crossover unless you were Vincent K. McMahon Sr., who decided he just wanted the whole pie and eventually just started carving up these territories. And that eventually kind of led to the demise of stuff at Dorton, it felt like. I know they used to be like on tour a lot where, especially like Jim Crockett Promotions, they'd be in Winston-Salem one night, and the next night they'd be in Greensboro, or, they kind of worked the circuit as they went through the Carolinas. If you grew up in the South, and North Carolina in particular, you love wrestling, you know the name Jim Crockett, you know the name Jim Crockett Promotions. Describe for me, if you can, because I know you guys are a little bit younger than me, but doing the research for this movie, I'm sure you kind of got the feel for it. Describe the chokehold that NWA wrestling, WCW wrestling in particular had on this area here in the Triad in the 70s and the 80s and going into the 90s, and who the top stars were as you were interviewing these people for the documentaries. What names kept popping up?
We interviewed a guy by the name of John Hitchcock, who is a huge wrestling fan. He was a part of a group, that was referred to as Front Row Section D. He wrote a book with that particular name, and they would go to the Greensboro Coliseum a lot. They were some of the guys' first sets of fans who would come dressed weird and, weird for the time. And, pretty fashionable, I would say, though, with the Hawaiian shirts and the hats. Yes, also, sir. Some of the first group of fans that, would bring out signs and cheer for the heels and things like that. But he's in the film, and he said, it was like a religion. And that's essentially kind of what it was around here. If you think about it, in that time, 70s and 80s, in North Carolina, there were no Charlotte Hornets. There were no Carolina Panthers. There were no Carolina Hurricanes. So when it came down to the sporting world, you had college basketball, which was from November to April. You had NASCAR, which would come to, a couple of North Carolina tracks, maybe, 2 or 3 times a year. And you had pro wrestling, which was weekly everywhere. And so people absolutely loved it. And that's kind of what a lot of the chokehold was. You didn't really have the access like, social media and the internet to learn about wrestlers' real lives every day. So people thought it was real. People, were invested in what was going on every single week. And so it was one of those huge things for the area. And, it was kind of fun to just kind of explore that and what it was like for the heyday. And then that's, for as good as it was, it's just how bad it was when wrestling left Dorton Arena in 1993 and wouldn't return there for over 20 years. So that's one of the things we explore in there. And then we also explore a few other things when it comes down to wrestlers. I'll let you take that, Cliff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to touch on one thing Chris said, when you think about wrestling as a weekly show, a weekly live show, not just television, but weekly live, putting several thousand people in a building in a major town and in major markets all over the mid-Atlantic territory, there's a lot of great events that happen all the time. Everybody loves going to the circus, but you wouldn't necessarily go every week. To get you to go see something every single week, that's where wrestling had to be more real. That's where you got those moments you were saying before, the things that didn't feel quite as rehearsed. It didn't feel as polished. Mm-hmm. It had to be that way because that's what would bring people back to buy their ticket, get in their seat, in their row every single week for decades. And so the stars that then get made out of that, these aren't just people you see on TV. These aren't just like your local, television people. These are people because you see them every single week. So when you get stars like Dusty Rhodes, like Magnum TA, the Rock and Roll Express, you go back and you further, you get Wahoo McDaniel, Rowdy Roddy Piper, all of these people, Ric Flair, who you mentioned. We talk about in the film, we have an entire section of the film about a Ric Flair match that happened in Dorton, one of the highest grossing, to that point, the highest grossing night of wrestling in Dorton Arena was with a guy a lot of people probably don't necessarily know unless you're a big wrestling fan, named Buddy Landel. But he had been made such a star by this region, by the stories that they were telling every week, that those two guys could sell out Dorton Arena at 5,000 plus seat building on a rainy night in the middle of the summer. So it's just amazing how all of that came together to create this really special place. And that's why people remember it the way they do. When we started getting into the film, people had personal stories. It wasn't just, oh, yeah, I used to watch that. It was, no, I was there. I was there every week. I was there for this show. I was there for that moment. That star, I saw him at the grocery store, and I had to say something to him because I was going to see him, wrestling on Tuesday night at Dorton. So that personal connection was even deeper than we realized going into the film. And I think it's certainly something we tried to capture. And that I think is a big part of the film today that people can watch and hopefully re-experience if they were there, or get a new appreciation for if they've never heard of it before.
Joining me in the sneak peek edition of the Desmond Johnson Show, Chris Lee and Cliff Bumgardner, executive producers of When They Were Giants, a documentary on Dorton Arena in Raleigh at the North Carolina State Fairgrounds, known for a variety of events. Actually, I was scrolling through, I think their wiki, and it was showing there was concerts that were in that place as well. And
yeah, Prince was there.
Yeah, Prince and Rick James. It was a Prince and Rick James show in 1980. I was just like, man, I saw one. It was like Kool and the Gang, Yarbrough and Peoples, and somebody else. Like, man, they was killing it. They had a lot of like late 70s, early 80s, like R&B type acts coming through Dorton. And I was just like, man, if I was old enough to be able to go to some of that stuff, including some of these wrestling events there. So the NWA National Wrestling Alliance / WCW, they performed at Dorton 9 times from what I can find between early 89 and late 1990, which I guess would kind of maybe be the peak of when NWA World Championship Wrestling was really here. It was after Ted Turner had bought the stuff from Crockett Promotions, and it basically became what became known as World Championship Wrestling to many people that may have been watching on TBS, including a stop on the infamous Great American Bash tour that would happen during the summertime. And I think I've told Chris the story before. I met Ric Flair and J.J. Dillon as a little kid at the Great American Bash. It was at Greensboro. And I want to say it was like 86, 87, somewhere in there. And it was me, my father, my cousin, and my uncle. And we were late. So the matches had already started and we were coming into the arena. And if you remember the way the Coliseum was set up way back in the day, you're going into War Memorial Auditorium. You can, come in and go through the curtains or whatever. And we're coming to our section, and we see J.J. Dillon and Ric Flair dressed out. J.J., got his suit on and everything. Ric Flair's got the robe on. And they're standing at our entrance, like looking through the curtain, like at what was going on or whatever the match was down below. And they're just watching it. And my dad's like, hey, that's Ric Flair. It's J.J. Dillon. So we're walking that way because that's where our seats are. And we're like, hey, how's everything going? And my uncle and my dad start talking to him. And at this time, man, the Horsemen were like so hot in terms of heels. Like, I genuinely did not like Ric Flair. I genuinely actually was kind of scared of the dude. I'm like 8 years old. You know what I'm saying? Like, and he kneels down. So he's face level with me. He's like, how are you doing, young man? And I'm like, I'm okay. And I'm still kind of intimidated by him. And then he just lets out this huge woo in my face. And like, I take off running like down the hallway. And I'm thinking somebody's gonna come after me. My dad and my uncle are just laughing. My cousin's just standing there petrified. He's the same age, so he doesn't know what to do. And I just took off running down the thing. And up to that point, up until maybe a couple of years ago, that was the most famous person I'd ever met was Ric Flair. And they, like you said earlier, they were around in this area, like when they were doing these shows. It's not like you couldn't run into them. You could run into Dusty Rhodes at Staney's. You know what I mean? Like, just like they were here. They were in this area. And I know they were there too. Describe the building at Dorton, because I've heard that, and I've seen pictures of it. It's shaped kind of differently than you would normally see in an arena. And I'd imagine that would hamper like acoustics and things like that. But I've also seen things where like wrestlers complained there weren't outlets in the locker rooms, or that it wasn't air conditioned. So it was a different experience going to Dorton, especially in the 70s and 80s. Describe what you found out from this documentary in terms of the actual physical building and like how it came to be.
I want to say something really quick though. Like what you just described right there, as far as your story, that's one of the things we got a lot from a lot of people when we were trying to do this, but then also telling people about, even if they weren't a part of this documentary, everybody has a wrestling story. And that's one of the things I think is very interesting about pro wrestling. Like, even if you don't consider yourself a huge fan, everybody has a story because something happened when you were a kid that you were exposed to that is implanted in your memory. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about wrestling. As far as Dorton, the actual arena, it was one of those. it's one of those signifiers for the city of Raleigh as it was trying to go into a new era of growth after the Second World War. They wanted to have a lot of different futuristic looking buildings. And Dorton was supposed to be the first of many, and that those many didn't necessarily come, but Dorton still there. And it's very uniquely built. It has, certain technology that was kind of unheard of back then. It's, the huge parabolic shaped things that's up there that's holding up the roof. They're actually suspended underground, connected by, cables. And that's what holds the building up. And we actually have design experts that are in the film who are describing what it was like, and we take you inside of what it looked like when they were building Dorton Arena back in the day too. So I think you'll learn a lot more about the building than maybe what you probably anticipated when you watch this film, for sure.
And let me just pop in before Cliff jumps on. Britt Whitmire, who I know is a huge wrestling fan, they actually do. Him and Bryant Williams do the KD Vic is Alive podcast that you can find on Spotify and other major outlets. You can actually respond when we're on live during the Desmond Johnson Show. If you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and you see our stuff there and it's live, this is interactive. You can actually go back and forth and ask these guys a question if you like, in terms of what you're listening to and what you're watching here on YouTube. I just want to put that in there real quick. Go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, one of the other aspects that we get into in the film is not just the history of the building in terms of its architecture and why that was so important, but also the building as a symbolic space. This was something that really took us by surprise. These days, we have, most major cities have some sort of arena. We've got basketball arenas, you've got hockey arenas, you've got major sports stadiums and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of funny sometimes to think about there was a time where that wasn't very common, right? That's a weird thing for us, I think, these days. But back at the end of World War II, not only was the idea we want modern buildings that are going to look a certain way and set North Carolina and Raleigh in particular apart on the national scene, they also were looking for spaces that brought people together. You've just come through a war and you've just come through a really divisive time. And so there was this idea, the architect, his name was Matthew Nowicki, who was Polish, came through World War II in Poland, which you can imagine what that would have been like. And he had this idea that architecture was a way to physically bring people together. When you make a big space that forces everybody into the same room to, in this case, it was for the fairgrounds and the cattle shows and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately for wrestling, for those concerts, for whatever. When you bring everybody together, you have a sense of community that you can't create any other way. This is obviously pre-social media, pre-internet, pre all of these things. And he wanted to see that be what Dorton would achieve. He wanted Dorton to be a place where people of all walks, all races, backgrounds, statuses in life, everybody could come together. What fascinated us as we started to learn that is at the same time that we were learning this info about the vision of the building, we were seeing these photographs that we have in the film from Dorton. And what you see in the crowd is that wrestling kind of completed that vision. You see the most diverse, amazing crowds packing out these buildings. It was a melting pot. Pro wrestling was a melting pot for people, particularly in the South and in these communities, to bring them together. So one of the other things we talk about in the film is how wrestling, not only was it a great show and it was entertaining and it was personal for people, but it also ties into the history of this place. They are interlinked in a way that you probably don't think about with most sports arenas these days. And that was a big surprise for us. And another thing that if you've never watched wrestling before in your life, there's still a story here that is fascinating and culturally, I think, really powerful, and was very interesting for us to discover along the way, because it wasn't one that we expected when we started out.
August the 8th, 10 p.m. is when you can watch this on PBS. If you're not able to watch it when it comes on at 10, it'll be available on the PBS app immediately following the show. And actually, you guys, I noticed you're doing a preview and a Q&A at the Rialto. Our boy Hayes Permar, if I'm not mistaken, on August the 6th at 7 p.m. And I think the last time I saw, the tickets were getting really low for that in terms of availability. So if you're wanting to go check that out, you might want to go check real quick because they might be sold out.
Actually, You can still go to that link, but you will be signing up for the wait list because as of right now, there are no spots available. But still sign up for the wait list just in case, because it is a free event, and the people who claim their seats ahead of you could decide, hey, I'm not feeling good today, I'm not going to go. I may not, whatever. I didn't invest any money into this since it is a free event, so I don't want to discourage you from going to sign up. But just when you go sign up, just go with the expectation that there may not be a seat available for you. But, there's always a chance that somebody could drop out. So still go there and sign up for the waiting list.
So it's a hot ticket already. And shout out to Hayes Permar doing a fantastic job with the Rialto reopening earlier this year in Raleigh. Can you remember the first live wrestling event that you actually attended, whether it was as a kid, as a young adult, as an adult? I know both of you guys have actually gone to these events, and you've touched on those. And Chris, I know you've lived in this world on both sides. What was the first wrestling event you can remember going to here, preferably in the state of North Carolina? Describe it to me, and how vivid is it still in your mind today?
So the interesting connection that I have to the time period in this film, and I said earlier, wrestling left Dorton Arena, which was WCW, in 1993. As we were going back and looking at the history, I realized that my very first wrestling event, which was in March of 1993, which was a month before turning 7 years old for me, was at the LJVM Coliseum Annex in Winston-Salem. And that the very next day, they were in Dorton. The next month, after my birthday, after I'd already turned 7, went back to the LJVM Coliseum Annex for my second wrestling event. The next day, they were in Dorton, and those were some of the last events that they were there in Dorton. So I was seeing events which had similar cards the day before some of the last events in Dorton. So for me, it was like you've been to the Annex in Winston-Salem, Desmond. So it's like when I think of wrestling, I think of the Annex, and I think of the big building, and I also think of Greensboro Coliseum. Like those are the three places that come to mind first, because those are the first three big places that I saw wrestling at. And it's just it was smaller, but it was big to me because it could fit about 4,000 people in there. You had those. It was a hockey arena. And so you had those locker rooms that were kind of accessible to the crowd, because you can walk all the way around the bottom part of the arena. And I remember one story where my dad was taking me to the bathroom, and we had to walk past one of the locker rooms, and they would use the different locker rooms for like home and away for heel and babyface. We were walking past the heel locker room, and I was hearing Flying Brian Pillman cursing up a storm and yelling at somebody. Like he was angry at somebody. I don't know, but you could clearly hear his voice, his raspy voice, that he had back in the day. And I was just like, oh my gosh, are they fighting in there? And my dad was like, I don't know. And he kind of like, put it, stuck his ear up to it a little bit just to see. And then he was like, yeah, we should probably just go to the bathroom and go away. Cause they were saying some things. Those were the first times I remember hearing some of those words as a kid. But no, it was fun. It's I miss those days. You see things from wrestling that maybe start some bad habits. The first time I saw like Cactus Jack, he spit in the air and caught it in his mouth, and I started trying to do that as a kid. So stuff like that, like those are the memories that I have that like stick with me. So that was the first time I saw wrestling in person.
Cliff, how about you?
That's great. I wish my story was anywhere near that good. I'm a little bit younger. I grew up very much in the WWE age, the kind of ruthless aggression era is what they tend to call it. So my first actual live show was a live broadcast of Monday Night Raw in Fayetteville, the Crown Coliseum. I'd always wanted to go. My parents wanted me to be a little bit older. So I think I was probably 8 years old, and my mom surprised me with tickets, and we got to go. And like I said, for most of my childhood and most of my life, there hasn't been wrestling in Dorton. It didn't come back until 2016. And kind of one of the genesis points for me with this film was in 2017, I got to go. And so I actually got to go see a wrestling show in Dorton, which now we have a couple every year, which is awesome, and really encourage folks to go back, because when you go, obviously didn't go back in the day, but from what people have told me, nothing has changed. It still feels the way it did. So I get to have a little bit of that glimpse, even though I don't have that great story about getting to see, people in the WCW era or the Mid-Atlantic era. You can still experience something pretty darn close. And I got to experience that there and see some legends who, like Mick Foley, I got to meet that night, and, see these great people who had come up wrestling there. I think one of the early shows in Dorton, what's kind of interesting is the main event had Cody Rhodes in it, who his dad, Dusty Rhodes, was the original booker and, one of the main stars. And so it's really full circle and cool. And I kind of feel that too every time I get to go. So it's fun.
I think Dusty Rhodes, I was thinking about this the other day. Dusty Rhodes is probably my favorite wrestler of all time. Just from childhood onward, just his swag, like the way he connected with the audiences, like his storylines. And I know he was a head booker for a long time in a lot of these promotions, including WCW. And that was when it was good. Dusty versus the Four Horsemen, like for years, like literally them breaking Dusty's leg in the cage or whatever. And I was thinking that was the first wrestling event I went to live, was that Great American Bash in Greensboro in '86. But one of my most memorable ones was the WWE Monday Night Raw in Greensboro. I was in college, and it was actually the one where I think it was Rock's birthday celebration that was supposed to be like 10 minutes, and it went like 30 minutes long. It was him and Mick Foley like out in the ring, and they brought out like The Rock's first girlfriend and like his like English teacher and like all this stuff, and there was like confetti. It was hilarious. It was like a 30-minute long like thing with like no commercial break. It felt like it ended up being like one of the highest rated segments in Raw history or whatever, and it just stands out in my mind that night. I want to say something else happened in the main event, the Triple H win or something happened at the end of that show. But that's one of the more memorable live events that I've gone to. And that went, well, it's a long time ago now.
Well,
years.
I have a story about that, if you don't mind, just really quick. I didn't do so well in like one of my math classes or whatever. I was in middle school or whatever when that happened. And my parents put me on wrestling punishment, which was the worst thing you could do to me.
Oh no.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I remember sneaking when they thought I was in bed, because that's when Raw came on at 9:00, sneaking and watching it. And, having the volume so low, but having my ear to this, but like dying laughing, but then also upset because it was like, if I would have gotten a B instead of a C, I would have been there.
Would have been there. Yep.
And it really, really made me angry. So
it's like one of the most talked about like segments in Raw history or whatever. We didn't even know it was going to happen. And then like it goes down. Actually, you know what? I remember why I remember that night so vividly. There were like 8 girls that started fighting in the stands, like up in the upper ring. And we knew them. They were from Kernersville. Like, so they started fighting somebody over the corner. We're over there looking like, what is going on over there? But just the wild night in general. And again, wrestling fans, wrestling audiences, they're unique and they're totally different than anything else. When They Were Giants debuting August the 8th on PBS, 10 p.m. You can catch it there. You can also catch it on the PBS app once the show is done. While I got you on here, I always talk to Chris. Now, Cliff, do you still watch wrestling? Are you still like involved in wrestling at all?
Oh, absolutely. Still a huge fan to this day.
Perfect, because as we know, SummerSlam is Saturday, and whenever I have Chris in the house and we're near especially one of the big 4 pay-per-views, we typically we'll chop it up and see what we think about what's going on. What do you think is the best storyline going on right now in WWE, Raw or SmackDown? There's a number to choose from.
Ooh. You know what? One of the things about WWE being so hot right now is the fact that there are so many different storylines. So that are going on that I'm interested in. And I can't pick just one. Like, I'm interested in seeing what ends up going on with the bloodline. With now, Roman Reigns probably going to come back next week at SummerSlam. We'll see. But Solo Sikoa is calling himself the tribal chief. So what happens with that? Then you've got Dominic Mysterio, Rhea Ripley, and Liv Morgan in that love triangle.
I'm surprised how much I enjoy this angle.
it's so well done. It's gotten me so interested in it. And then also this whole Drew McIntyre versus CM Punk thing. Like, CM Punk literally has not been in the ring since Royal Rumble, but has had one of the most impactful years of anybody in wrestling by simply being there, making Drew McIntyre's life a living hell. And so I'm interested to see kind of what happens in their match. Those are the top 3 for me, but there's like everything else I think is still very super interesting. And we hadn't even talked about NXT, because I think NXT actually has the most consistent best show every week out there. But Cliff, I'll let you go ahead and take it, because I could talk forever about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's Punk and McIntyre for me, man. That whole angle, everything that they've done, WWE has gotten back to this thing, is what wrestling used to be and how it used to work was on a weekly basis. The television was to promote the pay-per-views and the live events, right? Then we had an era where it was like television was the product. That was what you were watching. If something big didn't happen, if you didn't see a title change hands or whatever, you were disappointed. WWE has gotten to this point where not only with their television, but with their in-between pay-per-views, they don't have to do very much. The stories are so good, they can just keep stretching it out. They can hold you and they go, yeah, we're not going to lose you. We know we got you. We're just going to keep this kind of percolating. And then we're going to get to Mania or SummerSlam or the Rumble, and that's where it's going to happen. And that's what they've done with Punk and McIntyre, where not a lot has really happened. If you sat down and wrote it out, you'd be like, that's the big angle that has everybody talking. But in practice, it's been riveting. And Punk has been my guy for a long time. And the way they've played into him coming back into WWE and McIntyre walking out, that one story on one night got twisted and turned into now 6, 7, 8 months of story, I think, something like that.
And they're not even like relegated to just Raw. Like, we've had, Drew McIntyre, see what they popped up on SmackDown, advancing the story. And I got to admit, because I'm not a big Drew McIntyre fan. Everybody knows I do not like CM Punk. And I've really just come around on this version of Seth Rollins recently. Really, by the time we got to WrestleMania weekend was when I was like, okay, I'm into Seth now. I get it. Because before, the whole Joker persona was kind of annoying to me. Like, I didn't really get it. And then once he won the world championship and then they started putting the show on his back, I started to understand it. So I agree that one, putting him as a special guest referee is interesting, because really it was supposed to be Rollins versus Punk at WrestleMania. That was supposed to be night one main event. And with Punk getting hurt, they had to turn. Which
is the best thing that happened for this story.
Best thing that happened, because then all this started, and he's got a history with Drew. They just went through their back and forth over the title. So it makes sense for Seth to be the special referee between these two, because all it's gonna do is promise us some kind of screwy finish, and it'll probably set up for either some sort of triple threat between the three or something. But they're making it where they're giving the three of them meat to work with. And Drew McIntyre has been a top 10 troll online with this, which has expanded it even further. But I got to go what Chris first said. This bloodline thing is very interesting to me, because I didn't want them to take the belt off Roman at WrestleMania. I want them to keep going. So to see what they're doing now, Roman has become a babyface and hasn't even been there. Like, literally, like, it's fascinating to me to see the transformation. The only person I could think of that's followed the same path was The Rock, where he was a face. He was getting kind of jammed down your throat. People revolted. He flipped to a heel. People started to love him. Then he comes back kind of as this tweener, kind of a face, still will talk trash to the audience type of guy, but everybody loves him. And this iteration we have now with The Rock as the final boss, same thing. He kind of knew they can't boo me the entire segment, but I'm gonna call Phoenix the meth capital of the world and that kind of stuff, and they're gonna laugh and they're gonna cheer, and it's like, I'm talking about them. Like, he's kind of figured it out. And I think Roman's gonna do the same thing. I'm imagining he'll probably come back here during SummerSlam and disrupt this Cody Rhodes Solo Sikoa title match. What's up, Jacob Fatu, man? Like,
love that guy.
This dude is he's great.
Here's one of the things, and I hate saying it like this, but when you have like legit felons and criminals who are part of wrestling, it tends to be better and tends to be more believable, because they're just tapping into their real life. You know what I'm saying? Like, and for a very long time, which is understandable, WWE wanted, the clean image. They wanted guys with a clean record, and because a lot of those guys are risky, because at any point you could have a PR nightmare, but at the same time you have that type of guy on your television and it feels real. He's one of the more realist feeling. He hasn't even had a singles match yet, and already, like, I believe him more than almost anybody else on that roster.
That's crazy.
And a lot of it is just his presentation and just his facials are just so amazing. And if they ever get Zilla Fatu as well and have those two together
Oof.
on the roster, like look out, like that's the meanest tag team that you could ever have. Honestly, like they're running a rampage through that roster.
There's so many layers, and to bring this back full circle before I get you out of here, the booking reminds me of old school Dusty Rhodes booking. Triple H and Paul Heyman to an extent. It feels like Paul Heyman and Roman are kind of booking the bloodline stuff, which has different branches. Cody Rhodes is kind of involved in it and helped him keep elevating to where he is. But Triple H as a whole and Shawn Michaels in NXT, it feels like they have taken that Dusty Rhodes booking that made Dorton Arena so special, that made Mid-South or Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, WCW, NWA, all that stuff from the 80s in particular. It's the same thing where it's Dusty versus Ric Flair, but that's a 10-month long angle. Like they literally are stretching this through the summer, through the winter to the payoff. And the payoff is the babyface finally catching the villain or whatever. And that's the ultimate story. And that's what they're doing. And all those matches or all those things you just talked about, there's a villain, there's a face, and there's some sort of point to what they're doing. And it's not going to be a quick payoff. We're out of the world of hot potato with the belts and stuff like that when Vince McMahon was running the booking and they were changing stuff like, 20 minutes before they actually walked out of Gorilla. So it's different and I'm enjoying it. And we go through these stretches as wrestling fans where we're either proud to say we're wrestling fans out loud, or we're kind of like, yeah, I'm a wrestling fan, like out loud. Right now, I think it's at one of the hottest levels it's been maybe since the Monday Night Wars in terms of like popularity and people just getting behind it. And you've got a variety of places to go now. But definitely check this documentary out if you are a wrestling fan, especially if you grew up in the Carolinas, in the Triangle area, or in the Triad area, Charlotte, Fayetteville. You kind of got the vibe of what we're talking about. When Giants walked here, August the 8th, 10 p.m. on PBS. If you've got a digital antenna, you can still watch PBS. You can still get to it on your TV. You can get to it through a variety of different apps. Like people have a lot of Roku TVs and things of that sort. The PBS app, you can download that to your smart TV. You can watch it there. And you'll be able to watch
what it looks like right here. If you're watching.
And you'll be able to get to it as soon as the show ends on PBS. It'll be available on the PBS app, and you'll be able to watch it there. Chris is no stranger to Tobacco Road and the programming here. Oh, shout out. Congratulations, man. Southwest Guilford coming on board with the Sports Network. So hopefully we'll be able to get you on some basketball calls here in the winter. We'll chop that up and figure it out. Chris Lee,
Go Cowboys.
Cowboy alumni. Yeah. So
Go Cowboys.
that. Anything else before I get you guys out of here? If you want to give your socials and things of that sort and where they can find you guys.
I'm at Chris Lee TV, LEA. If you are in the Triad, you may remember me from WXI 102 Jams. If you remember this from Greensboro News and Record way back in the day. And so spell my last name LEA. Chris Lee TV is where you can find me on social media, and excited to bring this to everybody here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Cliff Bumgardner pretty much everywhere. My name is spelled just like it sounds, and there's only one of them, so I'm pretty easy to find. I'm a filmmaker here in North Carolina, and Chris and I, this may be our first project together, but it's not the last, so definitely follow us. Keep an eye out for more sports-related content, more wrestling-related content, and more new projects coming very, very soon. So thanks for having us. This was great.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been super fun. You've been watching and listening to a sneak peek edition of the Desmond Johnson Show. The debut will probably be second week of August. We'll probably come on there. We'll be your home for coverage of high school football here in the Triad. Of course, Tobacco Road is your home for high school football in the Triad. I was just looking at the schedule. We've got some weeks where we've got 5 games live at the same time going on, which is just, wow. Yeah, it's just crazy right now. So those schedules will be dropping here soon. And this will be out. The show will be out probably around the second week of August. So for Chris Lee, for Cliff Bumgardner, I'm Desmond Johnson. You've been watching the sneak peek edition of the Desmond Johnson Show, brought to you by the Emergency Responders Credit Union in Winston-Salem. We will talk to you soon.